The third sign, another sign of the learned man of the next world, is that his mind would be directed towards such learning as will be useful for the next world and give encouragement to pious deeds. He will avoid those learnings which will bring lesser benefit and wherein there is much arguments. He also shuns the learning of practice and remains busy in arguments, is like a sick man who suffers from many diseases, but when he fears death, he goes to an experienced physician, asks him so many questions of the quality of drugs and complexities of the medical profession, but he does not ask him about the disease. This is the height of foolishness. One day, a man came to the Prophet of God and said, "Teach me some of the most strange things of knowledge." He asked him, "What have you done with the beginning of knowledge?" The man said, "What is the beginning of knowledge?" The Prophet said, "Have you known God?" He said, "Yes." He asked, "Have you learnt about the truth?" He said, "What God has willed." The Prophet said, "Have you known death?" He said, "Yes." He said, How have you prepared for death?" He said, "What God willed." The Prophet said, "Go and gain experience of these things first, and then I shall teach you some of the strange things of knowledge." A student should be like Hazrat Hatim Asim, who was a disciple of Shaqiqi Balaqi. He asked Hatim, "How long have you been in my company?" Hatim said, "For the last 33 years. He said, "What have you learnt from me during this period?" He said, "I have learnt only 8 things. Shaqiq said, "You are not learnt except for 8 things?" He said, "Yes, O dear teacher, I have learnt nothing except for 8 things. I do not wish to speak falsehood." He said, "Describe those 8 things to me. Let me hear them." Hatim began to describe them. First, I looked around and beheld that every man has got an object of love, and he lives with that thing until death. When he goes to the grave, he becomes separate from it. I pondered over the following words of God: "We are for God, and to God we shall return." So I have made good deeds as my object of love. When I go to grave, my good deeds will come with me to the grave. The sage Shaqiq said, "O Hatim, you have done well." Secondly, I have pondered over the following words of God: "As for one who fears the majesty of his Lord and refrains his soul from lust, paradise is his resting place." Quran 79:40. I have come to know that the words of God are true. I have tried my utmost to suppress my lust and remain satisfied with obeying the injunctions of God. Third, I looked around the people and found that everyone values what he possesses. Then I turned to the following words of God: What is with you will end, and what is with God will last. 1698. Then I began to give unto God whatever valuable things fell into my hands. Fourth, I looked around and I saw that everyone puts his trust in his wealth and his property, his name and fame and his honor and glory, and found that there is nothing in them. Then I looked to the words of God: "The most honorable of you to God is the one who is most God-fearing amongst you." 49:13. Then I intended to accept God-fear in my life till I am honored by God. Fifth, I looked around the people and found them slandering and cursing one another because of envy and hatred, and then I looked towards the words of God: "It is I who distributed their substance amongst them in their world's life." 43:31. So I gave up envy and hatred and realized that sustenance comes from God, and then I disliked the people no more. Sixth, I looked to the people and found them ungrateful to one another, and even some of them kill others. Then I looked towards the words of God: "The devil is your foe, and so take him as your foe." 35:16. So I took the devil as my foe and ceased to have enmity with people. Seventh, I turned to the people and found everyone seeking his livelihood for that, debasing himself and committing unlawful things. And then I looked towards the words of God. Quote, "There is no animal in the earth of which provision is not upon God." 11:8. Finding that I am one of those animals whose provision is upon God, I turned towards the duties prescribed by God and entrusted my fate onto Him. 8th, I turned to the people and found that everyone placed his trust in something created, something in wealth, some in their profession, some in his industry, and some in the health of their body, and then looked towards the words of God. If man relies on God, He is sufficient for him. 65:3. Then I relied on God, and He is sufficient for me. On hearing Hatim, Hazrat Shadiq explained, Hatim, may God prosper you. I examined the Torah, the Bible, and the Jabur, and the great Quran, and found all these to be center around these 8 things, and he put all them into practice and follows these 4 books. In short, learned men of the hereafter seek and acquire knowledge, but the learned men of the world are engaged in acquiring wealth and name and fame, and give up those learnings for which God has sent the prophets. Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.